She told the world everything. Every desire, every shame, every time she couldn't stop. This isn't just a movie. This is a confession. A cinematic descent into addiction, obsession, and raw sexuality. And for many countries, it was simply too much to handle. Welcome to the story of Nymphomaniac, a film so explicit it was banned, censored, and whispered about in movie circles across the globe. But what was this film really trying to say? And why did it need to be this graphic? Let's unravel the controversy. Directed by Lars von Trier, the film stars Charlotte Gainsbourg as Jo, a woman recounting her life as a self-diagnosed nymphomaniac. Stellan Skarsgård plays Seligman, the quiet, intellectual man who finds her bleeding in an alley and listens to her story. But the cast doesn't stop there. The film also features Shia LaBeouf, Stacey Martin, Jamie Bell, Christian Slater, Uma Thurman, and Willem Dafoe. And many of them perform in ways most Hollywood actors never have or would. The film is told in two parts, Volume I and Volume II, spanning Jo's childhood fascination with pleasure to her adult collapse into emptiness and violent self-destruction. Each chapter is like a confession, honest, painful, and often disturbing. Nymphomaniac, Volume 1. In her early childhood, Jo's father is a tree-loving doctor whom she adores, while her mother is a cold bitch. In adolescence, Jo loses her virginity to an arbitrary young man named Jerome. This first encounter, which ends with Jerome casually leaving her to fix his moped, leaves her disappointed, while Seligman observes the combination of the number of times Jerome penetrated her, 3 times vaginally and 5 anally, resembles the Fibonacci sequence. Several years later, Jo and her friend B engage in a contest during a train journey. Whichever has sex with the most passengers by the train's arrival at the station wins a bag of chocolate. Jo wins after filleting S, a married passenger who resists both her and B's advances until Jo forces herself on him. Jo then relays her first experiences with actual love, which she dismisses as lust with jealousy added. She takes on more lovers as she, B, and several friends create a club, the Little Flock, dedicated to liberating themselves from society's fixation on love. Jo eventually leaves after all the other members end up developing serious attachments to their conquests. As a young adult, Jo drops out of medical school and finds work as a secretary at a printing company. Her first employer is Jerome. She avoids his advances in favor of sleeping with other co-workers, to his consternation. Jo writes Jerome a letter after realizing her feelings for him, but is too late as he has left with the jealous secretary, Liz. She is immediately fired by Jerome's uncle, the actual owner of the company, for her incompetence, and goes back to indulging her nymphomania despite yearning for Jerome. While Jo is sleeping with one of her lovers, H, his wife arrives and admonishes both of them in front of her children, though Jo states in the present that this barely affected her. Another lover, A, subsequently arrives in the middle of Mrs. H's breakdown. The family eventually leaves, but not before Mrs. H verbally attacks Jo, slaps H, and flees the apartment wailing. A conversation about Edgar Allan Poe's death from delirium tremens reminds Jo of the last time she saw her father. She is the only one to visit him in the hospital as he dies of cancer. Jo watches her father experience violent spasms and paranoid delusions, screaming for his wife. To distract herself from his suffering, Jo has sexual intercourse with several people at the hospital. When he finally dies, Jo becomes sexually aroused, but is then overcome with depression. After Seligman explains how he feels Bach perfected polyphony, Joe talks about three lovers leading up to her cantus firmus. The bass voice, F, is a tender but predictable man who prioritizes her sexual needs over his own. The second voice, G, thrills Joe because of his animalistic control of her. During one of Joe's regular walks in the local park, Jerome finds her after separating from Liz, and they embrace. The two engage in authentically passionate sex, set alongside Joe's experiences with F and G, but Joe is distraught upon discovering she can no longer feel anything. Nymphomaniac, Volume 2. Joe becomes annoyed with Seligman's focus on allegories before realizing he cannot relate to her experiences. He confirms his asexuality and virginity, but claims this makes him the best man to listen to her story. Joe reminisces about a field trip as a young girl, whereupon she had a vision of Valeria Messalina and the whore of Babylon looking over her as she levitates and spontaneously has her first orgasm. This shocks Seligman, who explains her orgasm is a mockery of the transfiguration of Jesus on the Mount. In the past, Joe suffers a crisis upon losing her ability to achieve sexual pleasure, despite finding a different sort of pleasure with Jerome. When the two conceive a baby, Marcel, together, Jerome struggles to satisfy her needs and allows her to see other men, though this puts a rift in their relationship. Joe's quest to reclaim her orgasm culminates in visits to Kay, a sadist who assaults women seeking his company. At Christmas, after rescuing an unattended Marcel, who has wandered onto a snowy balcony, Jerome forces her to choose between the family and herself. She picks the latter and, after receiving an especially brutal beating from Kay that allows her to climax again, takes a path of loneliness away from her only chance at a normal life. Marcel is sent to live in a foster home. Several years later, Joe has regained pleasure, but her genitalia have sustained irreversible damage due to a lifetime of sexual activity combined with Kay's brutality. Her habits are known around her new office, prompting the boss to demand she attend sex addiction therapy. Joe becomes pregnant and seeks an abortion, but the doctor insists she speaks to a counselor first. This visit ends disastrously, and Joe decides to perform the procedure herself with several household implements and a wire hanger. This leads to a very heated argument between Joe and Seligman in the present regarding abortion rights. Joe reluctantly attends therapy and attempts sobriety. During one meeting, she sees a reflection of her younger self in the mirror, insults every member of the group, and proclaims pride in her nymphomania before leaving. Realizing she has no place in normal society, Joe turns to organized crime and becomes a debt collector. She reminisces about a house call to a man who she initially finds sexually unreadable. She ties him to a chair, strips him, and attempts to provoke him, ultimately gleaning that he is a repressed pedophile. Taking pity on him, she fillets him. Joe explains to Seligman that she empathized with the man's status as a sexual outcast and lauds him for going through life without acting on his aberrant desires. Joe's superior, L, recommends that she groom an apprentice and suggests P, the 5-year-old daughter of criminals. Joe is initially repulsed by the idea, but Joe and P eventually begin a sexual relationship. Joe ultimately inviting P to move in with her while hesitantly teaching P her job. During one round of debt collection, Joe notices that they are at a house belonging to Jerome and tells P to perform her first solo job to avoid being seen. Joe later discovers P is having an affair with Jerome. Joe ambushes the two in an alleyway and attempts to shoot them. When this fails, Jerome viciously beats Joe before having sex with P in front of her. P then stands over Joe and urinates on her before leaving her, as she was at the beginning of the film. In the present, Seligman suggests the circumstances of Joe's life were due to differences in gender representation. All of the guilt and shame she felt made her fight back like a man, ultimately forgetting to rack the gun because her human worth would not allow her to kill someone. Jo finally feels at ease, having unburdened her story to someone she truly considers a friend. She vows to rid herself of her sexuality before going to sleep. Seligman attempts to rape Jo as she is unconscious, but Jo wakes up and reaches for the gun. Seligman attempts to justify himself, but Jo shoots him, grabs her things, and flees the apartment. From the moment it was announced, Nymphomaniac became a lightning rod for controversy. Why? Because the sex wasn't simulated. Real sex acts were filmed and inserted with body doubles and visual effects. The result? A movie that blurred the line between art and pornography. In the United States, it received the dreaded NC-17 rating, a near-death sentence for mainstream theaters. In Turkey, Romania, and even parts of the UK, screenings were limited or blocked entirely. Italy's film board briefly banned it before walking it back under pressure. Australia gave it an R18+ rating, but warned viewers with intense content warnings. In some regions, only Volume I was allowed to be shown. Volume 2, which features sadomasochism and graphic sequences of abuse, was banned or heavily censored. But the bans only made it more famous. The forbidden allure of Nymphomaniac drew in curious viewers, critics, and film scholars. So what does Nymphomaniac really mean? It's not just shock for shock's sake. It's about compulsion, about how pleasure can become pain, how love becomes hollow. Charlotte Gainsbourg delivers a haunting performance, never glamorous, never fake. Her character's journey is ugly, raw, and deeply human. Director Lars von Trier called it a pornographic work of philosophy. It's filled with classical music, literary metaphors, and subtle commentary on morality and society. Some critics praised it as a masterpiece. Others dismissed it as pretentious smut. But no one could ignore it. The film's legacy is not just in what it shows, but in how boldly it forces us to question our own discomfort. In a world where sex is everywhere but rarely honest, Nymphomaniac held up a mirror. Not to titillate, but to confront. And maybe that's why it was banned. Because sometimes, truth is harder to watch than fiction. If you found this breakdown compelling, subscribe for more deep dives into the most controversial banned films in history. And tell us in the comments, was Nymphomaniac art or exploitation?